Hello everybody, this is Havoc and welcome back to our Victoria 3 Developer Diary Series, number 96, dealing with Open Beta 1.5 Update 1. This beta update will just make Warfare so much more in-depth, and I'm incredibly excited to see it implemented because what we've been missing here is a depth to Warfare, and seeing it steadily unveil itself is just going to be incredible. Now, of course, there's not only warfare-minded things, there's diplomatic areas, a large chunk towards economic restructuring, I guess you could call it, to really make things more stable, which is going to affect your standard of living. It's going to affect a range of things across your population, which won't necessarily make the game easier, but again, makes it much more structured and logical in a lot of ways. So this is a very exciting update that we're going to get to see very, very soon. Let's dive in. So to start, the update will launch early next week. So everything you're reading here, everything that I'm talking about will go up next week, which is really nice to see that we're going to see the effects of this pretty immediate. Now, of course, this next few paragraphs basically says, hey, this is what we're going to focus on. There's going to be graphics that are filled in, placeholder text, a lot of UX improvements and things of that nature, but also this is still an open beta. So we're not going to see huge refinements. Rather, it's going to be a slow and steady build up until that release. And that release is going to be in sometime in November. So update 1.5 will officially go live. So if you're wanting to hang back, see all the improvements without actually digging in it yourself because you're waiting for the actual update, you're going to have to wait till November, which is not a problem for me. I'm more than happy to see, 2 months of development to get to a very, very solid update, which of course I will be playing, hopefully, very thoroughly. So one of the larger updates to this idea of warfare, making it more immersive and more of a live simulation, is your formations will no longer travel in straight lines, but along roads and sea lanes to reach their destinations, and you can track that progress. Now, right now, at least they travel, and you can see that traveling across the map. But if you look down here below towards these sort of lanes and road pathways, you can see that they are going to actually have to physically travel across the country. One detail to note when you're playing the beta is the checks to determine if the formation can reach the destination is that they're not yet using pathfinding, but existing logic of just traveling. So they still haven't utilized the pathfinding techniques, but they're going to update these logic checks in order to use those pathfinder updates. But this has a larger implication, and I'll let you know why. So right now, in this image right here, the debug mode, the spline color represented the types of splines. Yellows are the roads or potential roads. Red are the roads that could be upgraded to railways. Blue are the sea lanes and sea nodes. And the cyan are coastal sea lanes that connect to sea nodes. So we see this progression that we see. Not everything can be updated to rails. However, that's still a possibility. So you can go from New York to your Mexican front. If you had railways, you're going to have a somewhat uninterrupted scenario. Now, I'm going to pull out my mouse, which is not something I usually do. But the real question will be, if you're in New York, for instance, would they travel all the way up here, go up to, Michigan area and then travel? Would they go all the way over to here? What is the path of least resistance? And that's what I'm very curious about. Is it going to be a situation where they will travel as far as they can and then go down roads and go down to here? Or will they utilize railways? Ideally, railways are the most efficient. But regardless, this is what we're seeing an evolution from. This is America at the start. So if we kind of see a progression between the two of them, you'll see that one, we start out with only roads, but by establishing railways, we're able to expand further and deeper and to be able to have a connection all the way across. And I, of course, hope that we have a international railway scenario that gets us some prestige or something of that nature, something a little more immersive from an event like that. Regardless, this is working primarily towards the army formations format, so we're not worrying about the economics, for instance. But regardless, this is a great thing to see, is that units are actually going to have to physically travel across the map, which means that you have another incentive for using railways, for upgrading railways in certain states to try and make sure that in future wars or in future engagements, you're able to transport your units across a large space much more efficiently. However, in this current time, there are going to be instances in which roads are simply not created. And this is going to be, if we looked at the United States, where Texas or Kansas or some of those more frontier states aren't going to have the road network systems simply because they are not developed. We see this right here in Brazil. Formations won't be able to reach a point using that travel network alone. So in those cases, they infer the additional pathing required by drawing a straight line from its source location. Now, the thing is that when that happens, it is significantly slower. So this is one of those ideas where you can start future-proofing your economy a little bit. If you are incorporating new territories that are frontier territories, regardless of if it's in Brazil or the United States or Siberia, if you want to more effectively be able to transport your units across, you're going to want to develop those states. Maybe it's just a literal infrastructure line that goes from one end of your country to the other, and which you don't have anything in north or south, but it's just going straight through, just so that you have a way to get across a large expanse of country without having to have these inferred purple lines that just cut through, because it is going to be significantly slower. You're going to see issues, and you're going to have speed issues. But on top of that, armies that now to travel overseas, they will also incur an additional docking speed when they are embarking or disembarking, which stalls their movement for a little bit of time. I like this. This is, again, just a little bit of an immersion into the war system itself. You're going to take some time to load a unit up onto a ship. It takes a bit of time to unload a unit from a ship. So having these sort of delays and stuff will factor into when you are able to do a naval invasion, for instance. Is it going to be efficient? Are you going to be able to do that in time? Is there a better place that isn't as risky when you're working about those embarking or disembarking penalties? Now, I will say that I haven't seen the whole horse and buggy on the map. I did look for it, but it wasn't there. Maybe it's just a little bit of a bug in my build or whatever. But in the future, this is what's going to be really cool, is it's going to display a proper formation. Not only that, but it will be sized according to the number of units and the commanders leading it. I'm super excited to see this. Map elements are stuff that just really get me all giddy inside. And so to see your army physically moving across the map is going to be, I'm going to be very, very excited. And it would be really awesome to see, especially in later games or when larger conflicts, of seeing these massive armies utilize these road systems and to see them actually physically walk across them. It's not something that's like, oh my word, this is going to change the game. But at least from a visual standpoint, it allows for that immersive gameplay just a little bit. But why is this formation pathfinding so crucial? Why has it been such an issue? And why are we seeing so much emphasis on it? Well, up until this point, this spline network that represents roads and railways and stuff, it's been purely aesthetic. It hasn't had an actual function. So they are they're taking this artwork, basically, that was used for decorative elements only and turning it into physical representations on the map that other elements will use. And that is a very difficult process. You can't just overlay your graphical road system and just be like, all right, 2 lines of code and our armies are going to start using them. No, you have to now physically create a node system. That's what this is. This pathfinding is a node system to allow your armies to utilize them based on X, Y, Z factors. So that's why it's going to take a while, and that's why you probably will experience bugs. It's actually implementing something that was designed to be art only into something physical inside space that other things are using. So patience with it as always. And of course, there is a bug kind of counter. Should you encounter any problems severe enough that they block your playthrough, you can change the use travel network define inside of the text file from no to yes to re-enable that straight line movement. So if you do experience issues with the update, there's at least a fallback, which is good to know. All right, so your armies are now going to travel along realistic and actual physical paths, but that's not the only addition that we have to warfare. Formation, command limit, organization, supply, and morale. This is going to, I wouldn't say add a lot of micro, although it will add an element of it. Rather, it is going to let you do more than simply say, go here, advance, defend, or stand by, because that's kind of where warfare has sat for the longest time. And we've already seen this organization and the ability to create your own units in the open beta 1.5, but this update 1 is going to make it even more intense in a very positive way, in my opinion. So a number of tweaks have been made to military formations to let you customize and optimize them in more realistic ways. The first is command limit. This one's pretty simple. Commanders don't have their own personal military force anymore. If you played 1.5, you'll notice that it's now, well, we can go down here real quick to where it's the first English army, it's the second English army. It's no longer tied to a single commander like you saw like in Imperator Rome, for instance. But those commanders do still provide a command limit according to their rank. It's no longer split up by regulars and conscripts though, it's just simply a total rank overall. The command limit of all commanders in your formation summed up to provide a command limit for the entire formation. If the number of units exceeds its command limit, the formation will regain organization slower, which is a very crucial aspect we'll address in a minute, and the excess will impose a cap to the amount of organization a formation can regain. So you need to keep those units in there. You no longer are able to have 120 units in a 60 unit command limit, for instance. And while they have fixed that in the past where it was you were able to resupply really fast because you had tons and tons of reserves, in this instance, you're going to want to keep to your command limit. Thankfully, there's a lot that can be done now that wasn't done in the past. You can't promote existing commanders. You can recruit new commanders as you have up to 4 in a formation, which is really nice to know. And then you can transfer the excess out of the formation into one that has room for them. This is what I had to do when I played as the United States in 1.5. I had to transfer because, well, I goofed up and deorganized or whatever formation that I needed. So I had to transfer all of those units. That's a really cool way and a really cool method of kind of transferring units as things evolve. In the beginning, you're not going to have a large formation of units in the Midwest, for instance, but you can recruit out of the New York hub and transfer over to the Midwest to allow them to get to that faster, which is a pretty cool thing in my opinion. So we see here that having more military units in a formation than its command limit reduces the maximum organization up to a minus 50% daily organization gain. Now, out of context, that seems pretty intense, but we have to give it context. What is organization and how is this going to really affect things? All right, when a formation is first created, it has an organization of 0. Organization will build up over time to the cap, which is informed by the command limit, as we just saw, with a 25% organization as the minimum cap. So you can have a foundation with no commanders, but that's not recommended. I don't know why you do that anyways. If organization is below 100%, the formation will be penalized depending on how much organization is missing. Those penalties range to a offensive reduction of 25%, defense reduction to 10%, morale recovery reduction of up to 100%, and a recovery rate reduction, how many casualties are recovered, the wounded versus killed, of 50%. That's intense. So as we just saw, that minus 50% means that your offense in theory is going to be reduced by what, 17 or 12.5%, 5% reduction in defense, a morale recovery of 50%, a reduction, which is very bad, and then a recovery rate reduction of 25%. So that's pretty darn massive, and that's just for going over your command limit. That has no other things. If it's just sitting at an over command limit, you are experiencing those massive reductions. Now, one of the purposes of organizations to encourage having sufficient command limit to effectively command all the units in your formations, obviously. Another is it means that in future updates, we can let you toggle certain mobilization options, even when the army is mobilized at a cost in organization or morale. In practice, this means that if you research a new tech during active warfare and you want to equip your troops with a new discovery, you can do so even while they're on the front line, but you'll have to be smart about timing to ensure the new equipment doesn't cause disarray and unnecessary casualties until your army can be reorganized. Now, in the past, if you updated your armies to have a reorganized tactic, essentially, you had a massive reduction in its offensive and defensive capabilities. I think they saw that that wasn't efficient, nor is it kind of true to reality, because a technological upgrade shouldn't cause a massive reduction in time meter, and it also ensured that you never upgraded and got any sort of advantage if you researched a tech in the middle of a war. This has been reduced now. Now you'll suffer not so much. You'll have to be smart about timing because it only reduces organization and morale. Now, I know you're saying, well, that's exactly the same thing. You're reducing offense and defense. True, I am, absolutely. And the organization is a factor, but it's not as intense. It's not going to be, all right, well, they're now at, 10 offense and defense where they were at 40 and 50 beforehand. No, it'll be a little bit less. So instead of being at 40 and 50, it's going to be at 30 and 45, for instance. So it's not as much of a hit, which means you could, while you are transferring your technology, have a little bit of a hit. You might lose a few battles, which is why timing is important. If you are at a standstill in your military, in your war at a front line, that would be a good time. If no one's pushing one way or the other, upgrade your army then. You see a hit to offense and defense, a bit of a morale, and I don't know if the AI would be smart enough to take advantage. You have more of an issue in multiplayer where someone's just hardcore Hawkeyeing a war and seeing, okay, they're transferring stuff, now's when I can attack. So it's not as much of a hit. It allows you to utilize those tech upgrades without waiting until the war is over before reducing the efficiency of your army. Now, supply is a little bit different. It's a little bit wonky, and we'll see how it goes. At the moment, supply for formations works very similar to how it does for commanders in the live version of Wiki 3. It's always 100% if the formation is a fleet, or if an army is fighting on the same continent as its HQ. If it's an overseas army supported by shipping lanes, its supply is equal to the shipping lane efficiency, which is affected by your convoy capacity and any convoy raiding damage applied to it. They've been working on this idea of raiding in convoys, so this kind of ties into it. Now, if an army is cut off from its HQ, supplies will be 0, which is bad news here. In future updates, they intend to impose a penalty from any input goods shortages suffered by buildings supporting units in a formation, and possibly some sort of fleet short capacity based on the size of fleet station in an HQ. This is crucial because if you haven't played the 1.5 beta, there are different mobilization options which will consume certain goods. There's a mobilization option that consumes groceries. So if you have an input shortage of groceries, then that mobilization option is going to affect how efficient your troops are. If you have a certain supply of medicine or of opium and that gets disrupted, then you are going to see some major issues. So the fact that an input goods shortage is now going to affect your army is, of course, obviously realistic, but also will force you to be a little more interactive during your war. If I have a shortage of groceries, I'm going to need to find some trade routes in order to compensate for that. Maybe I'll disengage the trade route after the war's over, but for the time being, it's what I have to do to keep my supply at its highest. Insufficient supply has no direct impact on its own, but it does have a strong influence on unit morale. Available materials are assumed to be distributed across units to be able to fight in the next battle. When those supplies are unavailable, it'll reduce the manpower that can effectively contribute. This is a good idea, but I think supply should also, I think it depends on the input goods. And I think this is where it gets a little more complicated, and maybe in a future update, they'll change it, because I hope so. Because right now, if supply only affects morale, that's not true to nature. For instance, we have issues of starvation. If you have a massive supply issue of groceries, and that's what your units are relying on to survive, you're going to see starvation, which is going to result in more casualties. If your input goods shortage is on rifles, then you should see a offense and a defensive hit. And morale is great, but I feel like it's a little too blanket statement over what supply should be affecting. If they're going to go so far as to say that supply is affected by input goods shortages, by supply lane raiding and things of that nature, then it does need to affect the whole gamut of input goods. If groceries only affects morale, if rifles availability only affects morale, if ammunition is short and it only affects morale, it's not taking everything into consideration. Again, you would see starvation. If there's a lack of medicine, you would see more people dying to disease. If it affects the amount of bullets or the amount of guns that an army is willing to fight with, then that's going to affect how efficient they are. Morale is a good hit, and I understand why they use morale, because we're going to see that in just a second. But I do feel like morale is too strongly tied to this effect of a low supply. Again, it's about to make sense because we're about to hit morale, but I don't feel like it's too over-encompassing. And maybe the developers did try and do input goods shortages across the gamut to affect all of those things. And maybe it was just too much, because as we're going to see in morale, it affects how many units are able to go into battle at any given time. All right, so morale. In the live version of Wiki 3, morale tracks towards the supply value such that units that belong to a commanders with subpar supply will reduce their morale to match. This also, of course, causes them to lose morale in combat. In the new update on 1.5, morale is always regained when a unit is not in combat, but if morale is currently above the supply value, it will regain much slower. Again, we're going to see a reduction in morale when supply is subpar, so it's going to match them anyways. Essentially, as we said before, supply affects morale. So if morale is even higher, but supply is lower, then you're going to see that match on it. Each combat unit tracks its morale based on a comparison of demoralized manpower and total manpower. This is where I'm getting to the point where supply has effect on morale, which has that overall arching thing. But each combat unit tracks its morale. So a unit with 60% morale and 800 manpower will only have 480 manpower available to fight with. So in essence, when it comes to the guns specifically, you're going to have less guns in general, which means that you won't have as many to distribute because there's not many people fighting. But I still think you're going to see a hit to the efficiency of it all. And I don't feel that morale tying to the amount of manpower is necessarily efficiency as its whole. It's a good overarching blanket statement, but it doesn't hit all the specifics of input goods shortages or supply rating convoys in particular. When all manpower in a unit is demoralized, it'll detach from battle. When units have detached, the battle is lost. So we can see here in this image, the military measure how much remaining power is ready for battle. The average morale of military units in the Mexican army is 95%. The current supply is 100. So in the next battle, they would hopefully regain that morale and be able to fight at maximum efficiency. All right, so the combination of these four attributes work together so you can always create the formation compositions you like, and the first battle always tends to be at full efficiency. If your organization supply is lacking, etc., your morale will not be gained fast enough to handle repeated losses. Line will break, front will be overrun. So this makes wars just much more, it turns wars into something that you really and truly only want to do as a last resort. That was one thing they wanted to push as one of the key pillars of the game, is that diplomacy is always the better option, or at least war is a failure of diplomacy. With all these factors going in, even large nations such as Great Britain or France or the United States will have to make sure that their ducks are in a row if they want to commit to an extended, protracted war in which they're using a lot of units. So again, all these implications are turning into the idea that war is more costly. It's again one of the founding things that they were talking about. It really truly will become more costly, and it allows us to be able to be more immersive in war and be like, okay, I have no other options. Diplomacy has failed. War is going to be the only way, but it is going to affect us greatly. I think these four attributes combined are a great step towards ensuring that. And to just be able to visually have that concept, the military panels has been revised and updated to incorporate a lot of these things. Of course, there are placeholder things of that nature, etc., but it's all good. So for instance, over here, we see that the command limit has units over that command limit. It's costing them quite a bit of money. They are currently at 100% morale, but they're also not mobilized. So that's not going to have an effect. It's once they're mobilized that you see that supply issue come into focus. These are your military options, your commander. You're giving him your standard options on what he needs to do. This is a promotion. This is moving him towards the front and preparing for a naval invasion, which is something that we will address here in a little bit. And this kind of gives you the breakdown. This is a 2-commander army in the 2nd English Army, has line infantry, skirmish infantry, and cannon artillery. And as you can see is well underneath its command limit, which we have a 3-star general and a 2-star general. And also this idea that you can increase what are inside of specific armies themselves. So they only have 1 line infantry, which I'm assuming, I don't know why they're adding more. You'd think they'd add more skirmish and maybe they just can't afford to, but they are adding a lot of cannon artillery. And even that breakdown inside of this, you can see there is no attrition right now. They're not mobilized. Again, command limit, morale, the cost that it takes to get them underneath. But then also, if we'll look here, this idea that we can decide what is inside of our army composition. Hussar, dragoons, cuirassiers, everything of that nature. So there's the idea of customizations across the board is really being implemented into this new update, and it's going to allow us to customize the way that we want, not the way the base game has decided. Really quickly, naval invasions don't actually work. Update 1 will address that. And it's long story short, naval invasions are a little more intense. It requires, again, that embarking, disembarking. And one of the bigger things that I'm seeing here is that It's a few more steps. It's a little more precise as well, but also it's going to require you to defeat a naval battle first before going straight into land battles. You know, it's usually the land battle with ships before, and if you win, then you're able to go in. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be a little more intense. Now, when playing Update 1, the 2 orders have been removed: standby and naval invasion. 1 is irrelevant, and naval invasion's handled a different way, as we just outlined. I'll let you read it. It wasn't super crucial for me, so I didn't want to focus on it for very long. Now, aside from that, Update 1, you won't notice much difference in how orders work. It's mainly taking out the things that are no longer relevant. Update 2 will have some new orders to commanders, which can affect the outcomes of battles. Now, this is behavioral based battle, or commands rather, such as advancing a front, raiding convoys, with all the different advantages and disadvantages. Additional orders can be unlocked by tech or different character traits, which I think is pretty darn cool. So for a hypothetical example, an order like Vicious Assault might act like a regular advance, but could inflict more casualties and devastation at the cost of morale loss on your own side. But that order might only be available to generals of a certain personality trait, or might be unavailable to kinder, gentler commanders. So you're going to, again, it helps you with your own playing style and how you want to approach wars and how you want to do things of that nature. So the intent for these additional orders is to provide more tactical options, long story short. Since orders now only define behavior, there's only a few orders you'd want to consider for every commander, and it's just, again, adding a little more flavor. I don't want to read all of this to you. You can read it, but that's the gist of it. We're getting into the economic side of things, and this is where, I'm not going to lie, my brain hurt a little bit trying to comprehend, so I may give you some incorrect information. I'm going to try and interpret it as best as I can. So what we experience in the mid to late game currently is massive unemployment and overpopulation. So what they've essentially done is they've made some changes that hit that a little differently and allow those curves to act in different ways depending on the standard of living. So we see this graph here, which represents both the pop growth, birth rate, mortality of the old systems and the new systems. So overall, there are higher overall birth rates and mortality, but lower differences between them, which leads to a faster generational shift. And by generational shift, that means that your loyalists and radicals will decay faster, while also literacy will come in much more efficiently, because you're raising, if it stays the same, you're essentially bringing in that new generation more steadily and more stably. And then that you're seeing the old ones die off who may have been illiterate specifically, and bringing in those new literate generations. Now, there's no immersion or annoying immersion dampening local minimum mortality, standard of living level 20. Both birth rate and mortality rate now drops expected with standard of living. Population replacement, which is what I just said, they're now achieved at standard of living 50, reflecting how most rich nations' increased populations come from immigration and not natural growth in the native population. This is an interesting aspect to it. It essentially says that at standard of living, everything levels out. Your decay and your birth stay the same, which means that in order for populations to grow, they're going to have to bring in immigration, or at least from those lower standard of living pops. It is what it is. It's just historical. And then here we see the differences of the standard of living rates and how they grow, and et cetera, et cetera. So we'll see the differences here. It's pretty darn intense. They have a lower base pop growth in the ranges from 1 to 25 overall. We see the highest and stablest population growth between 26 to 40. And then of course at 50, you see that cap. And so overall, it's going to have a more stable progression in population growth, which means that by late game, you're not going to be seeing these massive acceleration boosts, which the player just literally can't keep up with. Now, an interesting factor here is now unemployment ties to population growth, up to a cap, of course. But that means that the more population that you have, the less that the birth growth rate occurs. Now, I understand this in essence, but there is a lot of factors that determine that unemployment and things of that nature do tend to lead to pop growth due to, I say pop growth, population growth, simply due to the fact that there's not a lot to do when you're unemployed. And so you have to, well, not have to, but there are certain ways to entertain yourself that are free, although they may have consequences that are not free in the future. But regardless, it's just a way to curb that rampant unemployment, that rampant overpopulation is tying yearly births into unemployment. So if you have a massive amount of unemployment, you're going to see a great decrease in population growth. Now, what's interesting is they've made the number of urban centers produced by urbanization increasable by tech, which provides more employment opportunities for highly urbanized states. This is going to be good because if you'll remember in previous updates, we are starting to progress and move towards a hyper local situation in which buildings, both raw to refined and urban centers, are going to be local to their state only, and only when there is an excess will that overflow into other states. So this is going to be good, the fact that urban centers are going to be increasable. That means states like New York or your Paris state or your London state, where there are millions and millions of pops, you're going to be able to get more urban centers increasable by tech. So you're going to be able to invest in those states and see a better return on your investment in that area. So if you want to benefit, you'll need to provide other well-paying jobs and good access to raise the standard of living to improve the lives of your service workers. Now, failure to do this, because again, urban centers are low-paying jobs, you risk ghettoization of your overpopulated states. It's a job though, but still this is kind of a combat to giant states having a huge amount of population and your urban centers just can't keep up, which is going to affect their standard of living because services will just get outrageously expensive. So here we see those changes in order. You have your control, which is 1.5.1, next to your test of 1.5.2. And what we see here overall is that because the population growth revamps your urban centers, et cetera, you see a decrease across the board of GDP a little bit because there's not as much of a population, or at least an unemployment soaking up resources. You see your population go down pretty drastically by anywhere from 10 to 15%. And then overall, your smallest religions, your largest religions, et cetera, see a massive drop as well. But what is interesting is that your standard of living increases quite dramatically. An 8% increase in standard of living is pretty darn crucial. You see your average birth rate skyrocket because of the transition from death and mortality, et cetera. So right here, your average mortality is going to be higher than your average birth rate overall, which is kind of equal to that transition, but it is level. You see the birth rate is just slightly higher than mortality. So you will see a slower pop growth, but also that will reduce that generational gap that we saw earlier. And then some of the more massive things is that unemployment rate just plummeted from 55% on average to 32% on average, which of course leads to a huge drop in your unemployed population and unemployed pops. Now, what's also really kind of interesting is that buildings and building levels saw a slight decrease because you are counteracting things by building more service centers and urban centers and things of that nature. You're not having as many unemployed pops. You're going to have a more full economy, long story short. So it's a very cool thing to see overall. We're not done yet. This is a very chunky developer diary. Interest group traits. Many interest groups across various countries are now customized to have traits of different mechanical effects. What I love here is this: the Confucian scholars no longer have an inappropriate, be fruitful, and multiply to increase birth rate, but they now have an asceticism trait, which keeps the population in check for the standard of living drops. This is really nice. It's good to know that they are addressing, blanket traits and really creating this idea of country-specific ones. It just allows for, you're not playing the same mechanics every single time. They will have a little bit of an effect. Just some more examples here. For instance, in the petite bourgeoisie in France, you get cheaper loans, which will have a dramatic effect on your economy and how much debt you can spend because it will decrease slower, which is pretty darn cool. And then the already powerful petite bourgeoisie of Sweden enjoys special political representation in mining communities, so you get a 10% mines throughput. Now, of course, all of these are only able to be done if they are not marginalized or, things of that nature. So it's just cool to see that we have some more interesting traits in pop groups, and it makes that a little more intriguing to try and push certain laws or enact certain reforms to appease those if each country has its own unique flavor. Companies are some of the most exciting pieces on the economic side, I have to admit. I love this idea of gearing your economy, gearing your country towards certain things in order to establish these countries, or companies rather, and enact certain effects. It gives you direction. Players need direction. They do. It doesn't matter how much people say they want to like Sandbox or they do enjoy Sandbox. direction is always going to be good for a player to not get bored and to be able to know where they need to go. Now, over 100 new historic companies have been added, which I think is pretty darn cool. So whereas before they were a lot more generalized, these are actual historic companies and they have historical effects. They have unlocked conditions working to improve UIs related to companies. So I think at some point they'll be able to have actual unique logos for every single company, which is a bit bonkers to me, but I think is also really, really cool. But they do have big plans for companies outside of just say, hey, build 5 building levels for the New York agriculture at 9.1 productivity, and at 100 prosperity, you'll get this effect. There's a number of behaviors that they'd like to establish in 1.5, but they're gonna have to be slated for the Sphere of Influence update in 2024. The reason is that there's a lot of Sphere of Influence effects that will affect how building finances work, requiring the support of foreign investment that they're going to add in that Spheres of Influence. So while those mechanics aren't going to be ready for 1.5, they wanted to get us under the idea of companies, their efficiencies, and what they can do for us before they really dive into making companies super fleshed out, which ties into that Sphere of Influence, or Sphere of Influence update in 2024. So yeah, we'll be able to see, you know, they're super generic now, but everyone's going to have a unique thing. These are super accomplishable in many ways. 73 building levels for American fabrics doesn't seem that bad. But again, this ties into how you want to approach things. Do I want the Southern Planters approval? If I do want their approval, then that's something I'm going to focus on. But if I would rather have rural folk approval, that's pretty easily obtainable. And again, we have to remember especially that if this is tied to New York agriculture, if it's tied to New York itself, it's going to be hyperlocal, whereas other things are going to be not hyperlocal. Now the company panel is accessible via this little button, which I think is great. There's a lot of UI elements that they can implement here, which of course we see with standard Paradox games is having a lot of UI space to allow for those updates to be more efficient and be more effective on the panel for you to enjoy. So that's awesome. Now, for those of you who are more diplomatically war-minded and have a lot of subjects, this is for you. Imposing laws on your subjects. This is a feature that was intended for the Sphere of Influence, but they launched an experimental version for the open beta. Long story short, you can now impose laws on your subjects and essentially try and force them to enable it. Now, where the implications of that are is still to be kind of laid out. Now, this basically says, hey, enact tenant farmers, and they will do their best to do it. But in the future, we are going to see that there's other things they want to improve on. So instead of immediately starting to enact the law, they should get an event that allows them an range of options on what they can do, whether it's, okay, we'll do it within a certain time period, or just flat out no, which may have consequences for the subject themselves. We need distinctions between the certain types to enforce laws, UX improvements, an overlord boost to make it easier for them to enact the law, things of that nature. So right now, it's literally, you're going to do this and you're going to like it. But in the future, there's going to be some back and forth. It's going to be a little bit pushing and shoving to where it's not just, okay, they're going to force everything on me and I don't have a choice. Companies are great. Companies are going to have an economic effect on things, but building employment is the most exciting aspect of this developer diary that is going to tie into a stable economy that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. They have some changes in how and when buildings hire employees in 1.5.1 to tackle some problems present in the logic there, which became particularly evident when states ran out of workforce. First and more significant change is that buildings no longer always try to hire as long as they're not losing money. Instead, each building will make a prediction of how profitable it would be if they did another week's worth of hiring. This is great. I love this aspect. I love the logic behind this. So they're going to, at the beginning of the week, they're going to do a prediction. If I hired another week's worth of employment, what is that going to do to my productivity? What's it going to do to my profit threshold? If they determine that that profit threshold would cause a negative, they're not going to hire, and they would rather stay where they're at, regardless of if it's not producing as much. This is really, really good, because what you saw in throughout the development of Vicky 3 would be they would go up, it would be negative, so they fired a bunch of people. Then they would go up immediately the next week and they fire a bunch of people, which I have no doubts probably contributed quite a bit to your standard of living progression, because if people are constantly getting a week's worth of goods or wages and then getting fired, they're going to no longer have that employment, which is going to increase radicalism. Now that's the logic that comes to me. Whether or not that is actually the logic of the game, that's what comes in mind here. So they're not constantly hiring and firing. They're going to hire up into a threshold. Once that threshold is no longer profitable due to a weekly prediction, then they're not going to hire anymore. This creates a stable economy because it ensures that people aren't constantly getting hired and unemployed, hired and unemployed. And the second change to building employment logic is how buildings hire employees from each other. The current version, buildings that aren't fully employed and who can't find anyone willing to work will hike their wages to try and hire, or snipe as they call it, from other buildings in the state. This works fine when the buildings that's hiking the wages is more productive, but that can produce some strange results where you end up in the low productivity farm sniping workers from the high productivity factory, only for the factory to then raise its wages to snipe employees back and forth until the farm has tanked its profits without actually gaining anything in the process. To prevent this destructive back and forth, non-subsidized or non-government buildings will now only consider hiring from another building if their productivity is not only higher than the target building, but would also stay higher after the higher building gains 1 week worth of hires, and the target building's losses 1 week's worth of hires. So after the transfer of employees happens, you won't end up with one building hiring the same people right back. So we have two main systems here. One, a building will not hire if it cannot determine that it will be profitable after hiring the week's worth of people. That's step one. Step two is that it will not hire from another building if it cannot determine that productivity would increase on hiring those people. It's sort of the same logic, but instead you don't have an internal cannibalization of the workforce where they're constantly going back and forth. Again, stabilization is key. The standard of living is key here, because if you are a worker that is working in a factory at 15 pounds or $15 and a farm snipes you for $20, but then determine, okay, I can't afford that, so I'm going to lay you off. You see where the radicalization happens. You see where the standard of living issue comes in. So if we have a stable economy that is only focused on being profitable and not focused on hiring its maximum number of employees, you ensure that your productivity is more stable. You're not going to see coal jump from plus 100 to a 200 deficit, plus 100 to a 200 deficit, because it's constantly hiring and firing. You're going to see a stable economy, which allows you to, as the player, make more stable options on what to address. It's also going, I have no doubts that standard of living will increase. That radicalization should, in theory, drop down quite rapidly because you're not constantly dealing with unemployed pops hiring unemploying. Building employment is going to change a lot of things, and maybe it will only make a marginal difference. But to me, those two alone will stabilize your economy and allow you to make more informative decisions that aren't so reaction-based. A few things on the future focus. Naval warfare doesn't function at all. It's a big mess right now. They're going to fix it, hopefully, for update 1. Aim here is not to lose the aspect of strategic positioning of your fleets. You don't want to be chasing fleets, but rather deploy your fleets in strategic locations. Conscription isn't functional in the beta build at the moment, which means it is daggum hard to play as the United States of America because you cannot use your conscripts. You have to work on making a professional army. I didn't know that until I played it, and I couldn't conscript against Mexico, which makes things a little bit difficult. Hopefully it is becoming an update too, so keep in mind that if you play a country that largely relies on conscription, you can't do that in the beta build. Battle conditions feel pretty random and non-immersive at the moment. They're going to rebalance and adjust them. Upgrading units, balancing AI, don't worry about the tutorial, it doesn't exist. Other improvements and bug fixes, performance, all of that nature. So overall, update 1 from Open Beta 1.5 is going to revolutionize quite a few things. It's going to make war extremely more immersive. I don't think it's going to increase in micro that much. It will increase in micro, but that's just the nature of warfare. Again, you don't want to deal with that, make sure your diplomacy is on par. But then also the economic side. Companies is a great start, but the building employment specifically is going to make things awesome in regards to creating a more stable economy, which I'm looking forward to. Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be it for this update in this video. I hope you enjoyed it. It was rather chunky, but I imagine there's going to be other YouTubers who may go into a little more depth. I wanted to give you the synopsis of it all and also my thoughts on it. So there it is. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts on 1.5 update 1 in the comment section below. This is Havoc. I'll see you in the next video.